Hello and welcome to 10 Minutes On, the podcast where we look behind the headlines to discern what broader themes and issues may be at work. I'm Burton, a researcher and former lecturer at universities around the world, including in Europe, the Middle East and Southeast Asia. I've taught politics and international relations, so I see this podcast as an opportunity to apply that knowledge and insight in the service of a wider audience and to make sense of current events. This is a small production which I put out every Tuesday morning. It goes out on the major podcast platforms including Apple and Spotify. But this week I am experimenting with a video version of the podcast as well, which is available on YouTube. I'm keen to grow it and would welcome any support that you listeners can give it by rating or reviewing it on your podcast platform of choice, subscribing for future episodes, and sharing it with friends, family, and colleagues who you think may find it interesting or relevant. My aim is to focus on stories that sometimes receive less attention than the dominant headlines of the week. And this week, although much attention is focused on US President Donald Trump's summit in Beijing with the Chinese president, especially speculation over Taiwan, Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz, another development may ultimately prove more revealing about how Washington currently sees instability, regime change, and migration closer to home. That issue is Cuba, and specifically whether the United States still genuinely wants the collapse of the Cuban regime, whether it has started to fear what collapse might actually look like. Because last week revealed a contradiction in American policy. On the one hand, the Trump administration has intensified pressure on Havana since returning to office at the beginning of last year. On the other hand, it is simultaneously talking to the Cubans behind closed doors. On Wednesday, the director of the CIA, John Ratcliffe, traveled to Havana to meet his opposite number and reportedly offered $100 million in humanitarian aid if Cuba showed movement on economic and social security issues and undertook substantial reforms. That meeting came at a remarkable moment. The Cuban government had just admitted that it had exhausted its fuel reserves. At the same time, Washington was reportedly preparing charges against the 94-year-old Raul Castro, the former president who succeeded his brother Fidel Castro around 20 years ago, accusing him of authorizing the shooting down of 2 American aircraft carrying refugees fleeing the island back in 1996. So while the rhetoric remains confrontational, dialogue has clearly continued. And that raises the central question for this episode. What exactly does the United States now hope to achieve in Cuba? Officially, the answer appears straightforward: maximum pressure. Cuba has long been a thorn in the side of the United States, ever since Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution swept away the Batista regime, and with it, decades of overwhelming American influence on the island. What began as a nationalist revolution soon aligned itself with the Soviet bloc, and increasingly defined itself through opposition to the United States. The challenge for Washington was not merely geographical, a hostile regime only 90 miles from Florida, but ideological as well. During the 1960s and 1970s, Havana actively supported revolutionary movements abroad. Figures such as Che Guevara attempted to export the revolution to Africa and Latin America, while Castro consolidated communist rule at home through one-party control, repression of dissent, and the expansion of the security apparatus. For successive American administrations, Cuba therefore became a strategic irritant and a political embarrassment, a durable anti-American regime surviving in what Washington regarded as its own hemisphere. That tension was reinforced by repeated waves of migration from the island. Between 1959 and 1962, more than 250,000 Cubans left, many from the professional upper classes associated with the old order. Then came the so-called freedom flights between 1965 and 1973, when another 260,000 departed. In 1980, nearly 125,000 Cubans fled during the Mariel boatlift after Castro temporarily opened the port of Mariel. And during the 1994 Balsero crisis, which coincided with the economic devastation of the special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, around 35,000 more attempted to reach the United States by sea. Each successive wave became socially broader and more representative of Cuban society as a whole. By the 1990s, Washington increasingly regarded uncontrolled Cuban migration as a national security concern, especially after the chaotic scenes surrounding the Mariel and the Balsero crises. It was in that context that the Clinton administration introduced the wet foot, dry foot policy during the mid-1990s, whereby Cubans who reached the American soil could remain while those intercepted at sea would be repatriated. That policy remained in place until 2017. Meanwhile, economically, the United States continued to heighten pressure or tighten it on Havana. The Reagan administration designated Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism in 1982. Barack Obama removed the designation in 2015 as part of his attempted rapprochement with Havana. Trump reinstated it at the end of his first presidency. Joe Biden removed it again at the very end of his administration. And then Trump reimposed it once more in January 2025. Since then, Washington has tightened sanctions further, including measures against foreign companies doing business with entities linked to the Cuban military. Most significantly, the US has clamped down on fuel shipments to the island since the start of this year. The Cubans describe this as a genocidal energy blockade, and the effects have been devastating. The current humanitarian crisis has been described as the island's worst since the late 19th century, during Cuba's War of Independence against Spain. Some analysts now argue that conditions are even worse than during the special period of the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union caused Cuba's GDP to fall by 35% and foreign trade to collapse by 74%. Even before the current crisis, there were fuel shortages, but the present blockade has dramatically intensified them. Part of the problem is that traditional suppliers have largely dried up. Mexico reduced shipments, while Venezuela, which had previously supplied up to 35,000 barrels of oil a day, enough for roughly half of Cuba's energy needs, effectively stopped deliveries after the United States launched its operation in January to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and fly him to New York to face drug charges. In March, Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel admitted that no fuel had entered the country in the preceding 3 months. And since then, Cuba has imposed severe rationing. Blackouts now last almost 20 hours a day in some places. Hospitals have limited operations. Schools close early. Cooking is only possible at certain times. Many households have reverted to charcoal. And last Wednesday saw the largest protests against the government and the energy crisis since the blockade began. Now, at first glance, this may appear to support the logic behind Washington's policy. Pressure the economy hard enough and eventually the regime collapses. But that assumption increasingly looks questionable, because the United States may now be confronting a problem that it did not fully anticipate. Cuba still possesses cards to play. The first is migration. Since the ending of wet foot, dry foot in 2017, migration patterns have changed dramatically once again. More than 850,000 Cubans traveled north through Central America and into the American Southwest between 2021 and 2024. The migrants are increasingly younger and more socially diverse in terms of race and class than earlier exit waves. This has major implications both for Cuba and for the United States. For Cuba, it has caused a demographic strain, reducing the population by 18% and limiting the number working and weakening already fragile social and care structures. For Washington, the surge of Cuban arrivals prompted the Biden administration to loosen restrictions on their right to live and work in the country. But following Trump's return to power and his broader anti-migration agenda, that open door was shut, making many fear that they could be picked up by US immigration and customs enforcement officers. At the same time, the prospect of state collapse on an island only 90 miles away from Florida becomes potentially alarming. If the Cuban state were genuinely to fracture, there may be no functioning authority left capable of controlling the departures at all, and that would make it far harder for Washington to deport those Cubans that they consider as irregular migrants. This may explain why negotiations are continuing despite the hardline rhetoric. The second card Havana possesses is geopolitical caution. At the beginning of this year, the rapid removal of Maduro in Venezuela appeared to embolden the Trump administration. There was increasing talk that Cuba, and especially Iran, could face similar pressure. But events since then have complicated that thinking. The lesson from both Venezuela, and even more starkly Iran, is that removing a leader does not necessarily remove the regime. In Iran, the decapitation of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei did not produce moderation or collapse. If anything, it exposed how removing pragmatic or balancing figures can strengthen harder-line factions instead. Washington may now worry that the same logic applies in Cuba. After all, there is no significant organized opposition movement on the island capable of replacing the current system. Nor is there an insurgency waiting in the wings. Any attempt at a forced regime change would almost certainly require direct American involvement on the ground, and that seems improbable. The United States is already heavily stretched by events in Iran. Opening another major front in the Caribbean would be politically risky, strategically expensive, and potentially open-ended, especially when Cuba itself poses little meaningful security threat to the United States. For all its historic symbolism, from the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s onwards, Cuba today has limited regional influence and relatively shallow ties with America's major rivals. Relations with Russia are largely symbolic and centered on modest fuel shipments. China has signed investment deals and energy contracts with Havana, and Cuba is formally part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but the practical impact has remained limited. Military ties with the PLA are piecemealed. There is no Chinese military base on the islands capable of threatening the United States, despite growing alarmism in Washington and despite Trump's December 2025 national security strategy that emphasized American dominance of the Western Hemisphere. So what reforms does Washington actually want? Economically, the likely goal is further dismantling of Cuba's state-dominated economy. Some privatization began during the special period before stalling in 1996. Reforms resumed again in 2011 and expanded further in 2021, and those results have been significant. 2 years ago, private sector sales in goods and services overtook those of the public sector, rising from 44% in 2023 to 55% in 2024. Meanwhile, private sector employment is approaching parity with the state sector, with around 1.6 million Cubans now working privately out of a workforce of roughly 4 million. Politically, however, Washington would presumably like much more: the abandonment of state socialism and movement towards political pluralism. But that appears far less likely. A generational transition has been underway since 2018, accompanied by a new constitution, but Cuba still lacks free elections and organized political opposition. If anything, the armed forces appear increasingly central to the regime's structure and survival. So where does that leave Cuba? In a position of profound weakness, but not necessarily imminent collapse. The humanitarian situation is deteriorating sharply. The fuel crisis is crippling daily life. Public frustration is growing. But at the same time, the absence of a credible alternative means that pressure alone may simply produce prolonged social misery rather than regime change. And that creates a dilemma for Washington. The harsher the pressure becomes, the greater the risk of uncontrolled migration and state failure. Yet easing pressure risks appearing politically weak after years of hardline rhetoric, which may explain why the United States is simultaneously tightening sanctions while quite quietly negotiating with Havana. In other words, Cuba may now be too weak to threaten the regime, but also too fragile to be allowed to collapse. So that's it for this week. I hope you found this look at Cuba and US policy interesting. If you did, I would be grateful if you would share the podcast with others who may also find it worthwhile. And if you could rate, review, and subscribe so that you receive future episodes automatically, that would help the podcast grow as well. So thank you for listening, and I'll be back this time next week with another look at a world event currently shaping international politics. Have a good week, and goodbye.